This is Bonjour Chai, the Habs are the only good news in Canada this week edition. I'm Avi Feingold in Montreal, and I am here with Melissa Lantzman in Toronto and Alana Zakon in Vancouver. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's episode, we talk about the terrible crime in London, Ontario, and we will welcome Nakuset on the show to discuss Native-Jewish relations, especially in the wake of the recent discovery of the mass grave at a residential school in British Columbia. How are you guys?
It's been a tough week for the country.
It really, really has. Has there been any good news?
Well, I'm going to disagree with you on the Habs news, but all joking aside, I think the country is reckoning with sort of things outside of our immediate COVID situation, and it's been a tough emotional week across the board, and it feels like no matter what community you're from, there's something.
Yeah. I don't know about you two, and maybe it's just because, since we started the podcast, I'm just a lot more aware of the news. But it just feels like during the pandemic, it's been like one thing after the next. And maybe it's because we're all in lockdown or versions of lockdown. We're at home. We have more time. We're not socializing as much. That people maybe are noticing more. Or was this always there?
I think it's always
now
there.
We're just seeing it.
I think you're reading the news a lot more.
Probably am.
For Melissa as the news, I'm sure Melissa's a crazy news junkie, and she's been like, the past year and a half, there's been nothing going on. What's going on?
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's case numbers and what's open and what's closed.
Yeah. Well, my kid's graduating elementary school. So that's
fun.
Something. She's the French valedictorian, which is not bad for a kid born in America, and only came here when she was 4. So I'm proud of that. That's some good something.
That's
other people
something.
are graduating. They're allowing us to attend in person, which was a decision made last night about being able to attend graduations in person. That's kind of cool. Although I'm gonna miss. The synagogue, the Shar Shemaim is doing for one night only. Melissa, have you ever been to Beauties?
Yeah, of course.
Alana, have you ever been to Beauties?
Weirdly, I've walked by it 1,000 times, never went inside.
So Beauties, because of the pandemic, did a full gut reno.
Really?
And before they officially open, because the entire kitchen was brand new, they're like, let's go kosher for a night. And so Monday night, Beauties is going kosher. We had a reservation. We were supposed to go. And now my kid's graduating. And so I have to pick an authentic mishmash omelet or my daughter's valedictorian speech.
What a tough decision.
What kind of omelet?
It's a mishmash omelet. That's the thing.
Also, is Beauties really going to be Beauties if it's renovated? Isn't the whole point of going there?
I think they just
old-timey...
I wasn't a gut reno. It was a facelift. It was cleaning it up and stuff like that. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Anyways, before we get to our first topic, let us hear from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Atelier Lou Bijouterie in Montreal, Quebec. Atelier Lou specializes in watches and custom design jewelry along with a curated selection of designer jewelry. Visit us online or in person, and Eric Goldberg will make your jewelry dreams come true. Atelier Lou is offering a promo code for all Bonjour Chai listeners using BON18 at checkout for 10% off your order at atelierlou.com.
This past Sunday, a man jumped a curb with his truck and senselessly killed a family by ramming into them. The outpouring and protests against Islamophobia and the outpourings of support and vigils have been, it's sad that is what it takes for something to be heartwarming these days, is in the aftermath of a tragedy. But it's been really, it's been good to see a country come together over something that is so tragic, and that easily, if you ask me, could have been preventable. But there's one thing that I really got struck by when hearing the first day. All I kept hearing about was, is he Jewish? That name, is it Jewish name? Is he Jewish? Is he Jewish? Is this somebody that was Jewish who was Islamophobic? And then there was this huge relief amongst a lot of people that I'd been seeing online and in person, of like, oh, thank God he wasn't Jewish. And it really hit me. I was like, what's going on here? Is it better that he's not Jewish? Why is it better that he's not Jewish? What is going on, right? Does it absolve us of any sort of communal responsibility? somebody help me out here. Why does it even matter if he was Jewish?
Look, I don't look at it as absolving the community of anything. I think I think over the last number of weeks, particularly in the Jewish community, and certainly not to make it about that, there's been an increased fear and rise in anti-Semitism, and I think that this was just a projection of that fear of if he was Jewish, does it get worse for us?
Yeah.
I think people are thinking about it in that way, right or wrong.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing. I think everyone's just like a little bit scared. It's like, is there going to be another reason for people to come attack us? Not to take away from the crime, because I think, and I agree with you, heartwarming feels like a weird word to use in this context, but like I do.
I agree.
But I really, really do appreciate how much the Jewish community has been vocal on this issue. Like I'm seeing it across the board, online, in person, having conversations with people. I think it's really beautiful that we're standing up for other minority groups, and it should always be that way with anything that happens, And
I will accept, by the way, that I was not expecting that, and especially based on stuff that I had said on this podcast in the past, and it was good for me to be proven wrong to a certain extent, or to a larger extent.
We've seen people saying that racism is the face of Canada, and I think it's important to understand what we just saw. The face of Canada was actually that vigil. The face of Canada wasn't the crazed lunatic driven by hatred of a religious minority who rams his truck into a family, wiping out generations. The face of Canada is and should be the people that showed up at that vigil, the people that showed up for that family. And I think there's not enough that's said about that.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I'm still like stuck a little bit on this, thank God there's no more anti-Semitism because he wasn't Jewish. Because on the one hand, the fact that we were asking ourselves this means that we could have been a community that released some individual like this from our community. Not even released, you know what I mean by this. Like, this could have been one of ours. The fact that we can even conceive that it was one of ours is hurtful to me. It's sad that there are members in our community that we can imagine would do something like this. And that's where this, like, oh, was he Jewish? Was he not Jewish? Right? It had nothing to do with anti-Semitism. I mean, yes, it had something to do with that. And I do acknowledge that there very likely would have been a larger backlash of or a larger spike of anti-Semitism as a result if this individual was. But it really, really disgusts me. Really, really scared me that that we're just asking ourselves, like, well, how much better or worse would it be if this person was part of our community or not? Because there are definitely layers to that, and not just the anti-Semitism. Yeah. There's this idea that, like, we could have easily, we can, like I just said, we could easily see somebody like that coming from the Jewish community, and the fact that he's not, well, that means that we're not that racist, or not that Islamophobic, or we didn't let one of our private Islamophobes out into the wild. That's not good.
I'm gonna cut in here. I very much disagree with that statement. I personally, when someone said to me, "Do you think the person might be Jewish?" and this is a Jewish person asked me this, and my first thought was like, absolutely not. Maybe, could it be? I hope not. That was kind of my thought process. But my first instinct was like, I don't think so. I mean, I really don't know. Honestly, I don't feel like our community, our culture, our whatever you want to call it, does breed, quote unquote, as you said, that type of hate. Like, I really don't. I don't think that's.
Have you heard of the Jewish Defense League?
Oh,
did you see
look,
the guy?
I'm going to disagree with you. Look, there is no monopoly on discrimination. It rears its head in every single community, and I don't think we can be responsible for crazed maniacs. I'm going to call this guy, fueled with a kind of hatred that is not taught in our schools, that is not taught in our community, that is found in places online. So I don't think this is a norm. I think this is entirely driven by what the Jewish community has felt over the last number of weeks, hoping that it doesn't get worse because people are scared and people are angry.
And I think it's proven in the fact that rabbis attended the vigils. Many Jewish people stood up for this. So clearly people are feeling for the community. I don't think people are. I think the reason why that this question came up was because of anti-Semitic people spreading these propaganda, lies, and conspiracy theories saying like, oh, this name sounds a little bit like it could be Jewish, when it turns out that it wasn't. So like, I think that little seed planted in, exactly what Melissa said. It's like, oh shoot, like what are people going to do now?
What if he was?
But he's not.
Let's bracket. Hold on. Let's bracket out the spike in the inevitable spike in anti-Semitism. Suppose this individual was Jewish. What do you think the communal response would be?
I mean, if to use another example, which is nothing to do with
no, hold on.
No, I'm answering your question.
Yeah.
Through another example that's on a different topic, but if you look at someone like Harvey Weinstein, Jewish person, did a terrible thing. Did the Jewish community all stand up for Harvey Weinstein? They definitely did not. So I don't think it would be any different in this case.
Yeah, look, you would call it out, you would condemn it, and you would know that it's not institutional within our teachings or within our communities, and suggesting that it is. I'm gonna bring up something that did happen at the vigil, which I thought was inciting of a hatred, and it was the last speaker at the vigil.
That was quite something.
Brother Bilal Rahal asked me to share final words. Well, I don't have to speak. Each and every one who's present here is a final word. You all said everything that needs to be said, except one angle I would like to share with our officials. Now, there's a reason why they say the world is a small village. Every country has a foreign policy. I just want to say, whatever is happening in Jerusalem and Gaza is related to whatever happened in London, Ontario. Period.
And it was absolutely disgraceful that somebody would turn a moving vigil into, or of victims of a complete tragedy, into this hate-fueled political pulpit that perpetrates the very hate that threatens religious communities across the board. And we've got to condemn that too. And we've got to stand up against that, because you can't have a tragedy with thinly veiled and not so thinly veiled threats about why this is happening, and to attribute that to the Jewish community.
So Melissa, you think that we should not conflate religious life with political life, right?
Look, I think if it was a real vigil to mourn the victims of this tragedy, then there should be no politicians speaking at the pulpit.
No, but I was saying it is important to separate political life from religious life, right?
Yeah, look, absolutely, and it's important
fundamentally. Does that mean we should separate? Does that mean that we should separate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
No, because they're one and the same.
Sorry, I'm just trying to rile you up here.
Look, this is one and the same. I think there's a role for politics and religion, and it is to uphold and protect the right for people to feel comfortable, to wear a kippah, wear a hijab, wear a turban, and walk freely in our streets. And I don't think this is the norm. I think this is an anomaly, and we should bring that perpetrator to justice in the best way that our legal system allows for it. And if it doesn't allow for it, we should make the changes to make an example of this, because it's not the norm.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you, Melissa, that even listening back to that recording and hearing people clap, it was like that crazy, like scary mob mentality thing. It's like from a theater background, in a show, like when you really want to get people in the gut, it's like you make them laugh and then an instance later you make them cry. And so it feels like it's like the reverse of that, where it's like, oh, this is a vigil and it's really sad. And then all of a sudden someone comes in and makes this kind of like political statement about Israel, and people are already so vulnerable that's very dangerous, because that could start like a mob if it was like the wrong place at the wrong time. But you know what I mean? So it does get I
think that's a rabbit hole that we can save for another time.
Totally.
It's a very deep rabbit hole that does warrant further discussion. But I, for one, would love to say that I do agree with you guys that it would have led to a spike in anti-Semitism. It would have been very terrible for the community. I am glad that this individual is not Jewish, simply for the reason, not nearly as much for that, but more for the reason that I want all of Canada to have some collective responsibility, to be able to say that we don't absolve ourselves, we don't wash our hands of the fringe elements, that we are still as a nation are responsible for living in a country that fostered, even on the very dark corners of our online nation, the ability for this hate to ferment to the point where somebody was willing to like do such an act. It happens in our Jewish community, but I'm very, very happy, you know, and like I said, it's not in the establishments. It's really like in the corners. It's people talking, people chatting around Shabbat tables and at Kiddush clubs and stuff like that. That Islamophobia is there. I'm not calling it out in this specific instance. I'm calling it out as a nation that this stuff is still there, and we still have a lot of work to do.
I think one thing, if I can add, is just I think this paints a picture of what it might be like for someone, let's say, who is Arab, having to deal with an act of terrorism that was committed and automatically, you know, going through security at an airport and being flagged because they're like, oh, you look like you could be a terrorist. Like, this is something that a lot of communities have to deal with. So it shouldn't be I don't think we have to treat it any differently on our end of things. If, you know, going back to what you said about if the guy was Jewish, it's like, we have to make that distinction and know that, you know, the Islam does not promote terrorism. Like, that's not part of the religion. And I know that for a fact from research that I've done in my work. You know, in the same way that Judaism doesn't promote killing. Absolutely not. So we need to be aware of that.
I couldn't have said it better. The discovery of a mass grave containing 215 children at the site of the Kamloops Indian Residential School has led to communal mourning for these and the very many other children that were lost to this tragedy, decades-long tragedy, as well as renewed calls for the important work that still needs to be done. This work to not only raise awareness, but to finally make just the ugly truths of Canada's past is long overdue. With us to talk about this and how the Jewish community can be part of this is Nakuset, who is the executive director of the Native Women's Shelter in Montreal, as well as the director of Resilience Montreal. Nakuset, without getting too much into your story, and we can get into that shortly, which everyone should look up online if you don't already know it, you likely have an understanding of the Jewish community better than most Indigenous people. You grew up in the community, you saw it in good times and at its worst. Where does the work begin? Right? How can we become better, not just putting out a pair of shoes or 215 pairs of shoes, and not just this week, but, you know, far beyond a single tragedy?
I mean, I think that people need to really understand the history, and that might be something that's a little bit more difficult in Quebec because the history books are very lean in terms of Indigenous content. So that there's like a personal responsibility of looking into what has happened to the Indigenous community. I mean, really just understanding treaties. What does that mean, a treaty, and when did that happen? So, for instance, I'm originally from Lac La Ronge, Saskatchewan, and my community signed a treaty with the Queen in 1876, which allowed all Indigenous Cree members to have $5 a year for being an Indian. That never went up. We still get $5 a year. And basically that was to take all our land. And then that's when the residential schools were implemented. And, basically most of our rights were taken away. That's a really long time. And it goes back that far. So people really need to, if they want to understand, is to not just look at history in the last 5, 10, 20 years, but to really take a look and to see how we have been displaced, to see how, there's been an effort to basically get rid of us. Like, not too long ago, they changed the street of that guy. What's his name? Oh, he used to put smallpox in blankets.
Amherst in Montreal became what?
Yeah. So, right. So it's really strange because if I'm going to have a street sign named after me, you would think that it would be for a good reason. But what do we do in Montreal is that, we have a lot of statues and street signs, even metros, right? Lionel Brew, I mean, he did a lot of, he was very racist against the Jewish community, and yet they're elevated and they're looked at as if they are important people. But, you really need
not a good friend of the Jews, I could say that.
Yeah, absolutely. So why does society do this? And so I think there's that sort of joint history of elevating really negative, horrible people as something that is sort of a leadership role that we should sort of embrace. that's problematic. So anyway, there are like, after the show, you can give like a gazillion links to sort of Indigenous history. And I mean, honestly, I've been living in Montreal since I'm 3 years old. And I find like I struggle with the fact that most Quebecers don't even know that there's 11 nations. Like that's something that should be in the schools. It should be a known fact that we have 11 distinct communities. Not even we have 52 communities, but 11 nations. Like we are really forgotten and erased. And when you just sort of do that to Indigenous people, then it allows for the negativity. And I think again that when you try to cover stuff up, then everyone is really surprised to find 215, bodies of children in a mass grave. It's like, oh, we didn't know. Well, why didn't you know?
So I can attest, having been brought up in Montreal and Quebec, that there's a huge, huge oversight in the education system around indigeneity. It feels like it was just this little blip at the beginning of our history book. And it was only upon moving to BC about 5 years ago that I really began to learn more, meet more Indigenous people, go to museums, go to see shows about it. I work in theater, and one thing that stands out to me was a show called Children of God. I don't know if you have heard of it. So that show was a musical about the residential schools, and seeing that show, I cried so much. And at the end, they had a Q&A where survivors of residential schools happened to come up and speak and ask questions. And after seeing everything that you've been through in those times in the schools, it just made it so much more real. And I was like, why can't we have this education in our school system? And it's amazing that that show toured across Canada. But I'm just wondering, in your opinion, why can't we have more of that education in the school system? What are the barriers, and what can we do to improve that, whether it's in the Jewish school system or just generally in the school systems in Canada?
Okay, well, I just need to talk about Children of God because that was in Montreal and it was at the Siegel Center, and I was hired by the Siegel Center to be that sort of outreach worker. So I would bring in Indigenous people to come and see the play, but I also was part of those talkbacks.
Oh, really?
Right?
Wow.
At the end. Yeah. So I loved that. That was really, really awesome. And again, I was able to watch the show. So every time every time I was working the show, I was watching the show. I must have seen the play like 20 times and cried every single time. It is really powerful. But, in terms of why the government doesn't, acknowledge or insist on having the proper history is because it really is an advantage to them. Right. So these sort of biases that are created benefit the government. Nobody wants to be seen as that person that, put smallpox in babe blankets or, stole land or, forced starvation or, they're all bad things.
Yeah.
Right. So it's much easier to just kind of put it under the carpet. No one will know. Let's just not talk about it. We won't mention any of the different nations or the cultures or the treaties or the agreements or anything. We'll just pretend like it never happened. And it's almost like ignorance, right? And that's what is being taught now. It's being very, very little. And when I went to high school, I remember I had some friends from Gunawaga, and they were irate when the history teacher would talk about history. And thankfully, our history teacher at the time was saying, "You're absolutely right. This is wrong," and that's really difficult. Wow. But if you have a government that wants to, deny systemic racism, it is because it benefits him. Because if he says that there is systemic racism, then he will have to change.
Yeah.
And people don't like to change. Right now, everything is working beautifully. Sometimes I feel like if we become empowered, then we will ask for change. And, right now, if we fight for our rights, then it will cost the government because they will have to sort of own up. So, yeah, I mean, basically schools, if they want to teach, there are many different ways that they can, if allowed. And there's an enormous amount of resources. And, there's this thing on YouTube, it is YouTube. And it's called Unpacking the Backpack.
and there's a woman named Charlene who does this sort of, it's almost like a monologue, and she talks about how heavy it is to carry our I guess our traumas.
Yeah.
And it's like, it is so powerful that I was in Calgary at a missing and murdered conference, and she came in and she only presented like 15 minutes of it. It's like it's a half hour monologue, but she only did 15 minutes, and every single person in the room was bawling their eyes out. So this is something that people can watch. Now, I think it was the Indigenous people that were crying. Colleague that was sitting next to me who is not Indigenous, and I was like, "How come you're not crying?" She goes, "Because I feel guilty." And we don't
Wow.
need that guilt, right? We need action. There are
Yeah.
so many different things that, allies can do by just sort of like asking questions. Why is this happening? Why is this continuing? Why are you, denying systemic racism? I think that, with what happened with Joyce Echaquan, there's a responsibility for institutions to, apply either Joyce's principle. If the government did the Viens commissions and came up with 142 recommendations and no institutions are implementing it, there's a question why aren't their hospitals using it? Why isn't youth protection using it? Why aren't the court systems using it? Why are, there's so many different things. Why are we sort of like, oh, that's a lovely report, but it doesn't apply to me, and I am not forced to read it, and I don't have to make any change, and we have to continue walking into these institutions feeling very uncomfortable and not knowing whether or not we're actually going to be treated in a good way.
I want to jump in here because I don't think, look, I'm sitting here in Ontario, and I'm not sure that the system is any better. When the bodies were uncovered from those unmarked graves a couple weeks ago, we talked amongst friends. When did we learn about residential school? And I think it was across the board that nobody remembers learning it in high school, in public school, or in the Jewish school system. And it was until university that maybe you got curious and you looked this up on your own. So I'm not sure that this is unique to Quebec, but governments across the board. There's been apologies. There's been memorials. What can we talk about in terms of real action? What does that look like for the community from a government's perspective, beyond the conversation of institutional racism? What does action look like, and what does action look like specifically, I think, from the Jewish community, given your story?
There's so much you can do, and there's so many different issues to address. And again, it is the Canadian government that implemented, the residential schools. It's the federal government that did that, right? They did all of it. Like the PASS system, the Indian Act, all these different things. So of course it's not going to be in the federal books either, because it is a stain on their face and they don't want to acknowledge it. They'd rather just ignore it. So it is like a, sort of Canada-wide issue, and probably in the United States as well. But that does not mean that, just people listening to this can't ask that question to their school board. Why is my child not learning about it? So, it gets very difficult for me because, I have, 3 children. 2 of my kids go to elementary school. They go to Hampstead School. And last week they were asked to wear orange shirts. So, my youngest Mohican said to me, okay, so can I bring the book? I bought them a book I found at Indigo called I Am Not a Number. So it's a children's book on residential school, but he brought it in. And he also wanted to bring in something to sort of show that he's Native. So I brought he brought in his baby moccasins. But, it's my children's responsibility now to go into that school and actually teach the class, because they don't have the tools, right? Or they're not looking for the tools. And that's really difficult. Like, it's not our responsibility to teach people about what to do. But, if we have to, we will. But what is your sort of, if you're brought to this land, I mean, you should have a responsibility to learn about the people in it, and you should also sort of acknowledge the fact that we continue to make efforts. So, I went and spoke at the missing and murdered inquiry, and there was a report that came out with like over 200 calls to justice, that nothing has been applied. Why hasn't that been applied? Why? Is that a question that you can ask either your, political leader, or even yourself? Can you read it and see? Because there's so many difficulties, right? I could literally spin a wheel and think, what am I fighting today? Am I fighting youth protection? Oh no, no, that is today. Literally, I have a meeting with you, with the group about youth protection, because there was a report that came out by the Human Rights Commission about the fact that youth protection has been taking the rights away from Inuit children in care, so not allowing them to speak their language. Wait a minute, they did that in residential school. Why are they doing that now? Do you see that if you don't address the issues, they continue to perpetuate? So, or sometimes this morning I was talking to, some people in the justice system about GLADU reports. Does anyone know what a GLADU report is? This is an issue because if an Indigenous person is being sentenced, the law says that you have to apply a report to look into that person's history and how colonialism has affected them. And then when that is submitted to the judge, then, they will sort of sentence them accordingly. Right. So I could literally spin a wheel and stop it and see, oh, am I talking about like the healthcare system? Like there are so many issues. It's so difficult to just, is there one solution? No. But I think that everybody has a natural tendency to work in a particular field. And trust me, that field, I'm sure, has been affected by, sort of systemic racism against Indigenous people. So that's sort of an easier way. Sometimes people say to me, oh, we would like you to come and speak to our group because we're going to address the TRCs and we're going to do the calls to action. I'm like, all 94 of them? No, you're not. You're not going to do them. So don't even pretend you're going to do them. When Justin Trudeau, when he, got elected and said he was going to do the 94 ones, I was like, buddy, what are you saying? You're making a commitment that you will never do. Why don't you say you're going to do 5 of them? And to date, I think there's only 10 that have been accomplished. So I don't want to overwhelm people with all the different issues that face. I want people to sort of, in Montreal, the Indigenous population is the highest population that is in youth protection, that is homeless, that is in jail. You can choose one of the 3, right? And sort of dedicate that. Or if you're into education, just bringing in speakers, right? If you were to bring in Indigenous speakers into the schools, that would help the children. It's much more fun to have someone come and, present as opposed to reading, something in a history book that actually doesn't exist because no one's written it yet, right? I mean, I think the solutions are there's a lot of them. You just got to sort of, look.
So, I mean, these stories, the fact that you've talked about youth protection as being the new residential school, the homeless issues, I guess at Cabot Square, which is right near my house, which is, a place that I should be visiting more often and actively working, is one of those places where we as a community can and should be actively working to educate ourselves about and to look at the injustices that have happened because of 200 years of injustice. As a final sort of a close, what are the good pieces? Where can we educate ourselves about communities, not just about the injustices, which are absolutely there and really, really horrible, but, how can I learn more about the rich heritage and the rich life that Indigenous people are living and are experiencing, and the history and the rituals and all of that stuff? Where do we fit in the Jewish community rather than just gawking and saying we're going to go to a public powwow or something like that? Or is that what it is?
I love powwows. Powwows are awesome. So definitely go to a powwow if you have the opportunity. But
You know, from the last time I had you on a podcast, I still I want to be at a sweat lodge with you one day.
yeah, those are tough though. Those are tough. The thing is that, like June 21st is coming up, and that is, National Indigenous Peoples Day or Aboriginal Day, right? That's a day that's actually pretty much ignored. So, I mean, I do a concert every year at Cabot Square, and I'll be doing one again, this year. But that is something that schools should actually celebrate. I know that they're talking about, making September 30th as sort of a remembrance to the Orange Shirt Day or Residential School Day. And it's kind of like, why do we have to be remembered for doom and gloom? Why can't we be remembered for all the amazing, musicians and filmmakers and artists and poetry writers and, actors and, community initiatives that are actually out there. So, I mean, people can like look up online about Aboriginal Day and see if any events are actually happening in the community, because usually they're more geared towards urban areas, or there's even shows on TV, that are going to be played. So you can sort of look into that. But again, look into your organizations, your local organizations, Indigenous-led organizations, and volunteer. And then you really have a really good opportunity to meet the people and really understand the issues they're going through. And then you can start really advocating, helping them to find a solution. Because I work with people all the time to, find solutions. And, I was able to work with the Israeli consulate this last August. I met with David Levy, and he was able to give us like something like $20,000 so that we could have showers at Resilience. And that is such a basic need, to take a shower. And he was, we were very, very lucky to have that collaboration with him, and people use it every day. Right? I mean, it's the little things that you wouldn't think about, or also, we had both the Shar Shemayim synagogue that donated food throughout the year at Resilience, or even that other synagogue, I forget the name of it, but it's on
The Temple Emmanuel.
Yes, thank you.
On Sherbrooke, Temple Emmanuel. So my wife is the Shar Shemayim. She was the one bringing you food.
Oh, I'm so happy. And it was so good, the food. It was so good. They were so happy. So, like these are really important things that people can do, and it's just basic needs. So you can start there, right? And there's so much stuff Excellent. On the internet. All you have to do is just like, Indigenous, arts, and take a look and see, and buy Indigenous books. Actually, pay it back to the community of those that are struggling and trying to sort of make it in the world through music, art, and all that, and be part of that.
Yeah, I know here in BC, the Talking Stick Festival's great. I used to go to it and volunteer in the past before COVID. I don't know what exists in other parts of Canada, but BC certainly does a good job at celebrating indigeneity, that's for sure.
Yeah, we're behind.
Well, my call then is to all the Bonjour Chai listeners that are in Montreal to message me, and we will organize a Bonjour Chai listener volunteer day at Cabot Square at Resilience. For anybody that's listening, you know how to message us, you know how to reach us through the Facebook page, through the CJN Lounge, through me personally. I'd like to see a handful of Bonjour Chai listeners to come and actually actively take part and move that needle a little bit forward. So that's that. Nakuset, thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you so much for helping us understand this a little bit better. And there is much more work to be done. We absolutely acknowledge that.
All right.
Nakuset is the executive director of the Native Women's Shelter in Montreal. You can see her story in a moving short film on CBC Gem and at the Toronto Jewish Film Festival called Becoming Nakuset. And her story is repeated many, many other times online. So go really do check it out. Thank you, Nakuset, for coming, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Shalom.
We'd like to highlight rabbinic voices from across the nation as they share a bit of wisdom with us. Today we are hearing from Rabbi Robin Fryer Bodson, who is a rabbi at Beth Tzedek Congregation in Toronto.
This week was the 65th anniversary of my father's arrival in Canada. And finally, I'm going to be able to hug him tomorrow because it'll be 2 weeks after my second COVID vaccine, and it's going to be the first time in over a year. The things we took for granted, right? If we look at the totality of our lives, then we will realize that this pandemic is actually just a blip, but it's an ugly blip that most of us despise. But soon we will return back to routines and a whole lot of, as the kids say these days, same, routine, how it's always been. A part of the same is returning to the classic Parshat Korach commentary. So I'm dusting off the classics for this podcast. In Pirkei Avot, we read that a machloket, a controversy for heaven's sake, will have lasting value, but a controversy not for heaven's sake will not endure. What is an example of a controversy for heaven's sake? The debates of Hillel and Shammai. What is an example of a controversy not for heaven's sake? The rebellion of Korach and his associates. So what do we know about Hillel and Shammai? Even though the Academy of Shammai declared one thing kosher, while the Academy of Hillel declared the same thing not kosher, and even though one forbade while the other permitted, the Academy of Shammai did not refrain from marrying the women of the Academy of Hillel, nor did the Academy of Hillel refrain from marrying the women of the Academy of Shammai. So these families of Shammai and Hillel could still sit around the table on Pesach or Shabbos, and they could talk to each other. They didn't allow halacha to get in the way of social interactions. And this is not always the case anymore. And although Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, they disagreed on so many critical issues, nevertheless, they behaved with love and friendship towards one another. So that's them. What do we know about Korach? Korach is the main character in this week's Parsha, and he's not the easiest person to like because he encourages us to think of our opponents, even our cousins, as enemies who deserve to be destroyed. Korach and his people rose against Moses and Aaron, and they said, "You've gone too far, for all the community are holy, everyone, and the Lord is in their midst. So why are you raising yourself above God?" On the words Vayikach Korach, the first two words of the Parsha, Rashi says, "Lakach et atzmo letzad echad liot nechelak mitoch ha'edah." He took himself to one side with the view of separating himself from out of the community so that he might raise a protest regarding the Kohanim, regarding the priesthood to which Moses had appointed his brother. Right from the onset, Korach wanted to separate himself out of the community. This word, nechelak, sounds a whole lot like machloket, which is the word for argument or controversy. A big lie, or in German, a grosse Lüge, is a propaganda technique used for political purposes, defined as a gross distortion or misrepresentation of the facts, especially when used as a propaganda device by a politician or an official body. Korach partook in a big lie, and that's why his argument was not for the sake of heaven. We need to fact check, and we need to remember that our cousins are our blood, and the Jewish community is our blood, and we need to talk to each other's faces and not through social media intermediaries. For those of us that engage in Torah study and follow our annual Torah reading cycle, then you'll know that nothing I'm saying is new. It's that same, but the same message holds up. But right now, it feels like it has more urgency attached to it. In the Gemara in Sota, we read that Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba says that 4 classes of people will not greet the divine presence: the class of cynics, the class of flatterers, the class of liars, and the class of slanderers. Korach, he didn't stand a chance.
Let's move on to our nachas of the week, where we'd like to highlight something which has come across our radar and given us some nachas as Jewish Canadians. Melissa, what's your nachas?
I'm. If you haven't checked this out, you have to. So here's my nachas of the week, and I'll start by saying I'm fascinated with Toronto's Jewish history, mostly because I think it's the community that raised me, and I'm a first-generation Canadian, and I wasn't part of that. It's not part of my psyche. So I love reading about it. My parents are newer immigrants. But over the pandemic, decades after it was written, there's a small graphic novel that had come out, and it's a memoir called Top, and it's about promoter Gary Top, and he used to work at this punk club I don't know if you can call it a punk club, a rock club. And he grew up in the quintessential sort of North Toronto Jewish community. Like, he references the camps that everybody knows and the shul that everybody knows in Midtown Toronto. But this is the guy who brought some of the biggest musical acts into the Toronto music scene. And, you know, we might not have hockey here in any sort of self-respecting way, but we do have a killer music scene. And he was the person that sort of brought in the Stones and brought in Dylan. And it's like this untold history of this guy who started, frankly, as a busboy at one of these clubs that are iconic to, you know, like to the punk rock scene in Toronto. And it's, you know, there's a lot of pictures in it, so I was pretty happy to get through it pretty quickly.
Sounds
Check
great.
that out.
I will. Alana, what's your nachas?
So this isn't exactly new news, but I'm getting really excited that camps are reopening. Some camps. My camp, the one that I went to, is reopening, Camp Masad in Montreal, or in the Laurentians near Montreal. So that makes me extremely happy, because just thinking about if I'd been at a camper age last year during the pandemic made me so miserable. Camp was such an important part of my Jewish upbringing, and just like upbringing and development in general. It was such a fun time to be away. So it's coming back at 50% capacity. I'm sure it's going to be strange to have to, you know, wear masks for the first bit of camp, and then make bubbles and all that kind of stuff. But it is happening, so I'm excited. Camp Masad is great. That's all I have to say. How about you, Avi? What's your nachas?
Does Masad make you happy?
I don't even know how to respond to that.
I know so many Masad people. I've never said that to anybody. But,
well, you said it now too. I don't even know how many hundreds
to
of
everybody
Canadians.
in the world. Okay, so I'm gonna do. So this is interesting. I like food. Either of you vegetarian?
No.
I'm about to do a non-vegetarian. Okay, Melissa.
Our listeners might be. It's not just about me and Melissa.
A part-time vegetarian
You're
between
part-time.
meals.
I was an accidental pescatarian in Vancouver for 5 years, but that's another story for another time.
So I'm about to make a carnivorous nachas of the week. It's incredibly hard to find really, really high quality meat. Meat is in abundance in Canada. The Canadian Jewish community loves its meat. The Jewish community in general tends to be very, very meat driven, especially the Orthodox community that tends to consume a lot of kosher meat. But up until now, the type of meat that you generally find is what's called wet aged meat, which is an inferior form of like making your meat increasing the quality of your meat. It's aged in a vacuum sealed bag for like a month, so it sort of sits in its own juices. Dry aged meat is really the way to go, but it costs more because you lose more out of it, and it's harder to make, and you have to be more controlled with it, and you have to know what you're doing. So until now, I have yet to find dry aged steaks in Canada. You find them all over the place in America, and Mahadran Meat on Bernard, in Mahadran Butcher Shop in Bernard in Montreal in the Mile End, has started doing dry aged steaks. I highly encourage you to go out for there. They're not cheap, but they are worth every penny. They have 30-day aged steaks. They have 60-day aged steaks, which are unbelievable. They've got this like funky blue cheese like feeling to it, and they're just more flavorful. They're tender. I highly go get an aged steak and a dry aged steak and figure out the difference, because it's great. I'm told that he even has some 90-day aged steaks waiting to finish off and to really get perfect. So that is my nachas of the week. I had some dry aged steaks last week from Mahadran, and I really appreciated that.
All right, you win this round.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for Thursday, June 10th. Our producer is Michael Freeman. Technical production by Andre Goulet. Our music is by So Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. Subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave a comment and a rating on the platform of your choice, and let us know what you think about our discussions on the CJN Lounge on Facebook. I'm Avi Feingold.
I'm Melissa Lantzman.
And I'm Ilana Zakon.